So I think we can resume, and we will resume from this example, right? So this example, we already commented this example, but in the break, during the break, I implemented it in the Visual Studio Code. So just copy pasting, nothing really special, right? So, I mean, not caring too much about the graph, I mean, not caring at all about the appearance and so on. Okay, so basically, I took the my app. So, let me see. I took the the white, create, latest, and so on with my app that we did the last lecture. Okay, so the basic template, CSS cleaned up, app basically cleaned up. Okay, there is this my button example that we already saw before, and now I added this counter. Okay, so just copy paste in the counter, and of course, I mean, just don't forget that you need to import functions, right? So that was like this, and in this way, oops, it doesn't work, right? Because just have a look at the console. When something doesn't work, look at the console, first place where to look. UseState is not defined, okay? We have UseState here. It is a function. It has to be imported from somewhere, from React, right? Because in app we had our component, my button, from button, and the button has its own UseState imported from React, right? So just copy paste. You need to import names in each file, right? So save, and reload. Well, there's no need to reload, it automatically reloads. Of course, I mean, it's really ugly, right? I mean, not really how you would like to design an application. But I mean, we are not caring about the aspect and layout. We have Bootstrap, React Bootstrap, and so on. If you want to have a nicer button, that's fine. I mean, just use a button, B, okay? And import it from React Bootstrap, right? Import button from React Bootstrap, right? So, I mean, these are details. I'm not caring too much about this. You have Bootstrap, you have React Bootstrap. If you want to make things nicer, it's so easy, right? I mean, the point is that do the button work? Do the the buttons work? Yeah, I mean, but debug it. Have a look. What is the state? Is the state in counter, right? So, in counter, up counter, okay, and here components counter. This is the state. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. Okay. Less 7, 6, and so on. And you will see that you can click very fast. I tried during the break. I wanted to check if it loses some events, but I mean, this example is too simple, okay? It doesn't lose any event. So in case you don't use the function to do the update of the state, nothing happens. But I mean, in general, we need to use the function, right? So click, 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 reset, set the state to 0, regardless of the previous value, okay? So that's good. Set count, props, initial count. Okay, an immediate value not depending on the previous one. That's fine. Okay, so easy to test the code, right? Test the code sometimes because it's good for trying the example we see. Okay, testing count from slides. Just push it so you have it on the repository for later. Okay, so let's proceed with a more complex example. So, at a certain point, it might happen that we have a state in a component. We say this state is private to the component. So, because you do use state, you get a variable and the set of the variable in that component. How can you use it from outside the component? in another component, in a children component, for instance. I mean, first of all, is it possible that this situation happen? Yeah, of course, it happens. It happens quite a lot, okay? So we need to find a solution. This is probably one of the simplest examples where we have the need for this, for this update of the state from outside the component, okay? Think of the case you want to design a group of buttons. I mean, we are designing buttons because they are easy. I mean, you can click them, right? And these buttons are mutually exclusive. So if you press one, the others need to be deselected, okay? So one is selected and the other are not selected, okay? So, of course, you have 4 buttons, 4 components. You could have 4 states, right? I mean, the state decides if the button is selected or not, if it's blue or gray, right? So variant, primary, secondary within the booster, and so on. But I mean, the state, selected yes or no, true or false. You have 4 states, that's fine. I mean, for the buttons, it works. But how do I ensure that if one is selected, the other is not? Others are not. All the others are not. That's a problem, right? Because inside the component, I only know the state about that component, that button in this case, okay? So the information about which button, what button is selected, cannot stay inside the button. It has to stay in another place. It has to stay up higher in the parents, in the tree, in the DOM tree, in the virtual DOM tree, and so on, okay? Because there is a container, something I will introduce, not necessarily visible in the user interface, typically not visible. It's a container, it's like a div, it's like a custom design component that says which button has been selected, chess, power, blackjack, go, whatever, okay? But then we have another problem. So the problem is we have a state. The state is inside the container, the component that contains the buttons. Okay, we can pass this state to the buttons. That's good because we have props and you can use a state as the value of a prop. That's good. But the problem is, how do we update the state from the children? Because the click on the button is on the button, it's not on the container, okay? We know which button has been pressed depending on which event handler or the 4 event handlers, each single button has been called. But we are inside the component of the button, so in the children, not in the parent. And the state is in the parent. So how can we update the state in the parent? Well, the solution is this one. Okay? So the solution is we keep the state in the parent. This is the selected, named selected, that's a state in the parent, good. And we pass the state to the buttons, that's good, because, I mean, each button has a number or has a name, and you can pass the index, the name, whatever you want. I mean, and the code inside the button decides if it is being selected or not, depending on the props it receives. Okay, but you can also pass, I think, yes, you can also pass another prop that contains a reference to a function. And the function is the function that will be called to update the state. And you can do it because you are in the component that has the state. So it has access to this set function that sets the state. Okay, so now we understand a very important thing, and let's say we encounter for the first time this very important case in which we see that we can pass functions, reference to functions as props. And this is done a lot of times in React application, because there will be many times where you have a state in a component and you want to update the state in another component. You cannot do it with parents because you need to pass it as a prop and the props can only be passed to children, not to parents. Okay? But you can also pass reference to functions, including the function to update a state. It's just a function. It's just a JavaScript function. As any other function, it can be passed around. Okay? So the problem will come out later in this lecture when we need to pass the information up. Actually, there's no solution to pass the information back to parents. We need to move the state up and pass the function down. Okay? A function to update the state. This is called state lifting, and there is a slide about this in a few slides. Okay? But first of all, let's try this example, because it's very important. Okay? We have a state in a component, and we update the state from another component. That's really interesting. Okay? I already, yes, I already have this code here. Code here in the examples. So what has already been published here in the slide examples, that's on the Git. It's a button group. Okay? Simple button group. Okay? So we copy paste all this stuff. That is basically the implementation of the example we saw on the slides, right? Where do we put it? Well, let's put it into app. Okay, so the my app, the usual stuff. Okay, just copy paste. Of course, it's not so, I mean, it becomes crowded. Maybe you want to put buttons in another file and so on. I don't want to mess too much with the code, so everything is one file, not so much code. So for us, that's enough. Okay, so function, simple button. It receives props. It receives also a prop that is named selected. If it's selected, so it's a Boolean, we decided to make this prop selected, Boolean. Okay, just to tell the button, if the button should be rendered as primary or secondary, so blue or gray. And then variant, okay, tells the React Bootstrap to make the button blue or gray, so we distinguish between the selected or not selected. And then there is an event handler, onClick. onClick, remember, it's an event handler. You need to pass a function. You cannot call a function directly. You need to pass a function. If you have a function to call, just open and close a bracket arrow, and you define a new function on the spot with the arrow syntax, right? And then, how do you update the state? Here, you should update the state, right? But to update the state, you need to get a function to call. And the only way in which we get a function from another component is through props. So props dot choose, another name we chose. Props index, so it's another prop we receive, and an index will be received for each button, a different index. And props name, that's the name of the button. Okay, so we have a very flexible component, simple button, that decides how to render on the basis of the props, and decide also what to do when it's clicked on the basis of what this function does. And this function is, what to say, I mean, the component, the button component doesn't know what this function is. It just knows that when the button is clicked, this function will be called. It means that it will put into the callback queue and then executed by JavaScript, okay? And then we know, because we designed the rest and we decided what to pass to the button here, the choose button, that this function will set a state, okay? Okay, good. So that's a simple button, right? And let's have a look at the button group. Button group is the one that has the state. Selected, set selected. Use state. Here we decide that the state is a number. Okay, so we see something different. There are four buttons. So 0, 1, 2, 3 are the valid values for our state. Okay? And we initialize it with 3, but because, I mean, just to try something different. Okay? And then we return what? The buttons. Okay? Just for convenience, we put it into a form, but I mean, not really necessary because we can manage single buttons as well in JavaScript. And you see, it's an array of buttons. You remember what we said about arrays on Monday. So if we return an array here inside the brackets, and this array contains components, they will be rendered one after the other as siblings in the tree. Okay, so one beside the other. Prop names map. So prop names is actually, yeah, I should still introduce this somewhere. Prop names. Where do we have it? Okay, save. Prop names is this array, 4 strings. Map takes the string and the index. You remember the map, the second parameter is the index, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. We return a simple button, name E, the string, index, I the X, I the X, index, key index. You remember we need a key for the arrays. So React doesn't complain, it's more efficient in handling the virtual DOM updates. Selected, that is the function, right? So we open the curly bracket. No, sorry, selected is not a function, it's a Boolean, right? Selected here. IDX equal to selected. Yeah, selected, that's the name of the state. So it's a variable, 0, 1, 2, 3. IDX again, it's 0, 1, 2, 3. And depending if it's equal or not, we return true or false. And so the button knows if it's selected or not. Depending on what? On the state that is in button group. And then we have chosen button, that's a function. Okay, the function takes an index and it simply set the index. Okay, here the state does not depend on the previous state because it simply depends where the user has clicked. It's not like select the next button. It's just I selected a button, I clicked on a button as a user, I want this button selected. So just set it as the value that I want. Okay? And let's try this code. So I took this button group names. Okay, so it's a parametric component where I have a property names and I can pass an array, and so I can create as many buttons as I like and with the names I like, right? So let me see if something shows up. No, let's see what's wrong. Form is not defined. Sorry, I mean, so easy to have things wrong, right? Form. Save. Okay. Really ugly graphics, right? But I mean, we don't care. You see, the third one is selected. Let's inspect what's happening. Components. Ooh. Let's reload the application. I guess this should work. Yes. Sometimes, you know, this auto reloading doesn't work very well. Button group. Button group has the state. You see, the state is 3. Let's click on the second button. State becomes 1. Okay? So the update here is a bit slower than what happens in the user interface. React, you know, updates the user interface quite quickly, and this is just a debugger tool, so I'm not sure what it's doing. It's probably probing what's happening in React, so it takes a while to update. But I mean, this is just for debugging. So, and so you see chess, power, blackjack, go, and so on. I mean, we implemented the behavior we wanted. Only one of these can be selected. Okay? You could try to click both. I mean, only one of them will be selected, right? Because this is determined by how we wrote the code. There is a state and there is a number. And you see, by the way, this tree doesn't change, but the value of the state changes. So this is just for initialization, okay? And to have it initialized again, basically at the moment we only have an option, reload the application, okay? Okay, good. So just one thing before going on and finish all the rest. I mean, of course, we can put it outside the paragraph, but you see what happens, right? Do you remember? Wait, let's save and see what happens. You see, not found, blah, 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 and so on. That's why you should come to the lab, because then understanding what's going on is a bit difficult, right? And the issue is here, well, actually, the Visual Studio Code is more intelligent here. It says, JSX expression must have one parent element. One means only one. You remember the React fragment we saw last time? that's the usual way in which we can solve these problems, right? So, and then maybe you can format the selection so it's much easier to understand the nesting level and so on. This is the way to create a single parent, right? One parent. Okay? And now everything renders correctly. And by the way, also a bit nicer, okay? Because you create a new line. Okay, but I mean, this is just very basic stuff, right? So let's commit this example as well. So this is the button group. Push. Oh, by the way, you can access all these commits, right? I mean, just, you know, lecture examples. Of course, week 7, my app. Now you have the button group inside the source, okay? That's the stuff we have. Of course, I left the rest of the code, but I mean, in general, I hope you know when you click here on the commit. No, sorry, what is the history? One parent commit. Okay, you can go back and so on. But I mean, you can see the content at previous versions. Or history, because history, I think. Okay, testing count here, and you see the version or the files as they were in the previous version. Okay, I mean, this should be just basic stuff, right? Actually, that's a web application. I mean, the GitHub in the web interface, it's a web application, right? I'm not sure. I don't think it's made by using React, but anyway. Okay, so let's finish the discussion and then try to update our example with the question and answers to introduce the state. So, React design hints, okay, about state. Try to implement stateless components as much as possible. Okay, I know this is an advice, I mean, kind of trivial advice. I mean, avoid using state. It's more complex than not using it, right? But I mean, of course, it cannot be really a definitive example, right? So, I mean, but in general, think twice before introducing a state. Maybe you can achieve the result just using props. That's fine, okay? In case you have a state and you need to have the state passed as props to other components and so on, you need to move the state to the common ancestors, it means parents, okay? This is called state leafing, and it's done a lot in React applications. In our very simple React application where the state is kept inside the application and we have no reducer and stuff like that and so on, basically it might happen that a lot of state values, variables, and so on, stays at the top of the tree. It means in up. It's not so uncommon. It's perfectly normal at the exam to have a lot of states in up, okay? Because up is the only parent for all the applications. So sometimes you need to give some values to a certain part of the application, so a certain part of the tree, another part, and so on. And so, of course, you lift it as much as it's needed, and sometimes that much is the root, okay? So up. And then you can pass the state value down to the children using simply the props. And allow children to request state updates by passing down callback function. It can be the callback, the set variable directly, or can be a function that can call the state, the set variable inside the component, and then you pass that function, okay? You create an additional function, you pass that function, as we did here in the example, right? So we created an additional function, choose button, that simply calls our set state, okay? It can be more complex. Of course, this example is so trivial, but it can do more operations, okay? Okay. What should go into a state? There's a guideline, quite extensive guideline about what should go into a state, okay? But I mean, maybe it's better to read this after a while, after you experimented a little bit, and also you load the data from the server and so on, because this is also other kind of data that should go into a state. So, tips, heuristics for state lifting. I mean, not all states need to be lifted up. Of course, it's just a button, a list that has to be open or closed by the user, but the content is always the same, but that state doesn't need to be lifted up to up. I mean, it's just a local state, it's just for visualization purposes. It's like the English, Italian of the button. Well, actually, that's not a good example because, I mean, the language could be a global state of the application, right? But, I mean, in general, you want to have a button larger or smaller and so on. I mean, that's a local state, okay? Such a state is not interesting outside the component, so that's an indication that you should not move up the state in other places. Because, I mean, you can. Everything works, but the point is that if the state is far from the place where you use it, you need to pass it to props. Every component has to pass it to props to the children components, right? So, not so good. And also not so good for the logic of the application. While in application components or container components, of course, they manage the information, the application logic. For instance, in our very simple example, which button is selected, so which game I'm going to play, okay? Usually, those components do not directly generate markup, but I mean, markup means the element trees, but I mean, depends. And having the state in a single place is also useful because it can centralize the updates, a single source of truth for the state, and so on. So there are many advantages. Of course, this example is very simple, but now we are going to see a more complex example, like the one with a list of questions. Okay? Good. So before going into the example, that's the last topic for today, a few slides about more complex values for the state. I told you, you can put arrays and objects. Arrays are quite common. I would say almost certain, 100% sure that for the exam, you will have to submit a project where you have a state which is an array, okay? Because, I mean, without an array, we cannot show anything, almost anything in an application, right? So, set the call to the set value of the use state with arrays requires that a new array is passed or returns, okay? Because it checks the reference to the array, okay? It checks the value, and the value, if it's a number, if it's a string, if it's a Boolean, can directly be compared. If it's an array or object, you have only the reference, and either you go inside the array and object, or you check the reference. And React decides if the state has changed or not, checking the reference. And that's important to know. So it means that every time you want to change something in a state that contains an array or an object, you need to change the reference. It means you need to recreate the array or the object, okay? So use a new array as the value of the object, and when referencing objects inside the array, also you need to use a new object every time a property changes. So if it's an array of objects, like it is in our application and in your application as well for the list of fields and so on, well, you don't have to change all the objects. But if a field, an object has changed, the reference to that object has to change as well. You cannot just change props inside the object and expect that the text that change in the props, okay? And typically use a callback to ensure no modifications are missed, because you are creating a new state, a new array that depends on the old array. Unless you are resetting the array, so emptying the array, so new state doesn't depend on the past. I mean, if you add, update, remove, and so on, you're doing something that depends on the previous state, okay? So you should pass a callback and not a direct value of the new array, okay? So let's see these examples. So there is the add, update, and add, update, and remove items from the array. Adding items. Don't use push. It's very tempting, right? I mean, array push, and you add something at the end. Push doesn't work. Push doesn't return an array, so that's wrong. Already wrong from start, okay? It returns the number of elements, not the array, so I mean, that's not what you want. Also, it modifies the array in place. We said we don't want to modify the array in place. We want to create a new array. So, have a look at the functions in the arrays. What is recommended is concat. If you check concat, okay, I'm doing it just once. MDN concat, Mozilla Developer Network, concat. is used to merge two or more arrays. This method does not change the existing array, but instead it returns a new array. Great, that's what we want. Okay. Parameters, you add the values at the end of the array. Okay, good. So that's good for us. Insert values at the beginning. Sometimes you want to insert values at the beginning. Concat doesn't work because it's inserted at the end. Okay? Either you manually create a copy of the array, and in some ways you manage to insert it in the beginning, or for instance you have the spread syntax, which works quite well. So create a new array, you open the square bracket, put a new item, and spread the old array. That's all. It's a new array because you opened a new square bracket. Okay? You open a new square bracket, it's a new array. It's a new reference to a new array. It contains a new item plus the old stuff. Okay, update. Well, you should know which item you want to update, of course. Either the index, the value, something. Okay, because you have a condition to test to check if, while iterating over the array, you want to check if the item needs to be updated or not. But the point is, we need to return a new array, always. So, return a new array, map. Map is a very good candidate. Map, it takes the element, current element of the array, it iterates over the array, it creates a new array. If you just return the element, map, and take return element, return element, you have a copy of the array, right? That's exactly what you are doing here. Map item, return item. If it's the element of interest, return a different value. Item plus one, item, the modified item, a function called on the item, whatever you want. In this case, there is an item that we want to increment, okay? I is the index of the element to update, okay? If j that iterates over the array, it's equal to I, the one we want to update, we perform the operation, we return a new value. In this case, it's just a number, right? So, and note that we pass a function, okay? We pass a function. Also before, we pass a function, all list arrows. So, we pass a function. This function will be called by React when it's time to update the state with the old value of the state. A bit more complex example, we have objects, okay? A number, plus one is really trivial, but let's say we have a list of objects, the list of fields, the list of answers that we have in our example during the lectures. So an array of objects, well, always, all list map item, if the item is what we want, and you can check the ID, you can check the value, whatever you think, it gives you the possibility to identify the object that you want to update, well, return a new object. And make sure you return the new object. You see there is a curly bracket open here. It means it creates a new object, a new reference to a new object. Okay? Item ID, val, new val. Even if the ID is the same, you cannot just simply say item.val equal new val. Return item. In principle, the data structure is updated, but React is not able to detect the fact that something has changed in the array, because it checks the references inside the array, the reference to the object. And if the reference to the object is the same as before, I think it hasn't changed. And so it tracks where it goes, it is passed as a prop. It thinks the prop didn't change. If the prop didn't change, it doesn't call the function to update the user interface, so to compute the UI fragment, and then to update the user interface, and the user interface doesn't get updated. Okay, so that's the the thing you need to care when you update the state. If you don't update the state correctly, when the state is a bit more complex, you risk that React doesn't detect the update, and so it doesn't update the user interface. And that's a problem, of course. That's a programming error. Okay? It doesn't crash, but simply the user interface is not updated. It's like when you press a button, nothing happens. You think the application is not working. Okay? And that's the point. Okay? So make sure you create a new object, new curly bracket. Removing items, and then we'll go to the example. Removing items, that's the filter function. Filter, you remember the functional methods on arrays? Filter returns a new array. It keeps the element only if the condition is true. So you decide which elements should be kept, like I different from J. Okay, it means that the I is the one that will be dropped because the condition evaluates, I mean the difference condition evaluates to false and it's not kept. In the other case, it is kept. You want to remove the first item, use the spread. That's fine. Okay? Again, you see the new square bracket creates a new array. Always create a new array. Okay? Before we did it immediately, okay, so we could have written return first and no, return list. No, here it's a bit more complex because we need to isolate the list, right? So we need two instructions. But anyway, yeah, so what I said was not relevant. I mean, yeah, that's a new array, but we are not returning this array. We are returning this array, and this array is created by JavaScript automatically. It's a new array, okay? So the spread creates a new array. That's what you need to know, okay? So it doesn't modify the array in place. Okay, so that's all. Okay, so this is the more complex situation, most complex situation you are going to encounter in your web application, probably. Because if you have a state that is even more complex, you might want to split into smaller states with different use states called from React. Okay, you remember we said hidden count mode and so on. If the state is more complex, especially with content that is not related, okay, so something like a list of items and a list of something else, okay, like a list of questions and list of answers, you may want to have two arrays, not two arrays inside the same state in an object, okay, because it's much easier to handle, okay. So typically handling arrays in a state, that's the most difficult situation, but we saw the difficult cases, all the difficult cases, so adding, updating, and removing items. Okay? So the rest of the lecture is about the example. So you remember that we have our React state, React QA application. So we stop the my app application, we go in React QA just state because I prepared the files and now we're going to modify them, right? So I think everything is installed, npm run dev, no, it's not installed, npm I for install, okay, now it's there. That's the application that we had on Monday, more or less, okay? I just fixed a few minor things like the buttons, and I'm using React Bootstrap buttons and all this stuff, okay? But I mean, there's no state inside this application. You can see it here now. So my app is closed, the React state. It's in source, in app, we have questions, answers, and so on. So we have an array, and this array is passed to an answer table component. This answer table component is, where is the answer table component? Oh, it's in answer component, so I just put it into a separate file. Answer component as answer table. Answer table has the header and the body, and you remember that you have the arrays, the array that is used with the map to create answer row objects, or components actually. Each answer row component takes props and shows something, Okay, so it shows the date, the text, the response, the score, plus the button, the B uppercase button from React Bootstrap. Okay, and that's what you get. Votes, and the buttons, of course, are not being used because there's nothing we can do at the moment. Because we can write event handlers, but event handlers, we saw this morning, have to modify a state. Okay? They cannot modify props. Props are immutable. So until we have props, we have nothing dynamic inside the page. Okay? We want to change something, we need to change the code, which of course is just for developing and not really for developing, I mean, for creating an actual application. Okay, so first of all, we need to decide where to put the state. What is the state and where do we want to put the state? Okay, so what's the stuff that should change? Well, let's first decide what we want to do. Well, I would like to have this button work. Okay, so vote and the score changes, as we did with the with JavaScript without React, right? You remember that we had the event handler, we pressed vote or plus, I don't remember what was the name of the button, and we had the vote that changed. Okay, so we destroyed everything, we recreated everything, and so on. More or less how the same as React does. And so we click on the button, we need to change the score. Where is the score stored? Well, the score is in the data structure, in up, right? See, in up, we have this data structure, answers, okay? The answers are the ones that are passed to the answer table. So inside answers, that comes from the init get answers. So here, models, the answers are this stuff, right? So here you find the score, 3, 1, -2, and so on, right? So it's an array of objects, okay? Array of objects. If you don't believe me, you can do what we did last time, okay? Console log. Oh, by the way, compared to last time, I just moved this code out of the component, but I mean, it doesn't really matter that much, okay? So, have a look at the console, and you see we have the array with the 4 answers, okay? So, the place where the vote is kept is inside an object, inside an array, okay? And we want to have an event handler that modifies this value. So this value has to stay in a state, because you need to keep track of the value to decide what to render in the user interface. And you want to remember this value. Okay, so you need to have a place where to store this information. Of course, we can say, okay, write an event handler and go into that data structure and modify the score. That's fine. But we don't take advantage of React. React doesn't know. So React will not update the user interface. It's up to us to update the user interface. And so React becomes useless. If we want React to immediately update the user interface when the data structure changes, this data structure must be inside a state. So React detects that the state has changed. The state has changed. It triggers a re-render of the user interface. And everything is updated according to the data structure. So we only work on the data structure using the event handlers and so on. And once we update the data structure, all the rest happens automatically. That's the purpose of React. Okay? If we are not taking advantage of this, we are not taking advantage of React, and we can take it, throw it away. We don't use it. It's faster and simpler. Okay? So we put this array of objects into a state. Okay? So we decided what to put inside the state, and now we need to decide where to put the state. So where do we write the use state call to React? Okay? So let's have a look at the structure. Components, app, container, row, call, that's a React Bootstrap for layouting. My header, main, row, question description, answer table. Well, that's more or less up to you, okay? Of course, I wouldn't put it into the header because the rows of the table are not children of the header. I would put it into up or something below up, like main or the answer table, okay? Of course, not in the service component like row and calls that are created by Bootstrap just for layouting, okay? It doesn't make that much sense. Let me see what I decided to do in the solution. Yeah, it was in main, okay? But, I mean, we can put it into table as well. I mean, table is probably not the best place because, I mean, table, I would say it's a presentation component, right? We pass something as props, and table takes care of rendering the table, okay? So, the good place, it would be main, okay? That is a container that indeed contains the table, right? So, we have main here. And you see that contains the question description, the answer table. If you have other ideas, just tell me, okay? We can discuss advantages and disadvantages. There is no single solution, especially in this, well, the simpler the problem is, probably the less variants are possible. But in more complex situations, you have different possibilities, and sometimes all of them are acceptable and have a reason, okay? So at the exam, make sure that you explain why you wanted to put things in a place and not in another. Just explain your reasoning, it's fine. I mean, we are not judging the reasoning if I mean, all alternatives have the same advantages and disadvantages. Of course, you have to choose one, okay? If there are disadvantages or problems, of course, we can question it and we can discuss about it, and that's important that you know how to handle them to get a good mark, of course. So const, user syntax. Question, yeah, question could be a state, but for the moment we just ignore it, okay? We are not modifying the question, so for the moment just ignore it. So answers, okay? Okay, good. Answers, set answers. Use state, that's the initial value, but I don't like to call the function again. I have answers, so I would write answers here. But it uses the same value. So answer, I think we have initial answers. Initial answers, okay? And we write initial answers here, okay? So initial answers, good. So we know this is just the initial value. It will be used only at first render, and then just ignored, okay? So the initial answer will not change. The state will change, okay? And it will be a new array every time, because when we set the new array, we will create a new array. So you can do console log of the initial answer, you will see nothing will change, even when we change the vote. Okay, good. And now we have to use this state, right? So actually, it's already used, right? Because we didn't change the name. So answers, answers. Answers is the state, answer is what is passed as prop. Okay, so it should already work. I think we need to import useState. It's already imported. Okay. So let's reload the application and see if something has changed. Nothing has changed. Button doesn't work yet, of course. No event handlers at the moment, right? But you will see the state, right? In main, you see the state. Answer, 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 answer. Oh, by the way, why there is no name on the state, just a number, 1, and so on? Because, I mean, React doesn't distinguish the states from the name. not using the name, but using only the order of the use state calls. It's something that we will discuss in next weeks. So, but for our purposes, it doesn't make that much difference. I mean, we are writing code in the component, so the code is always the same, right? First answers, and then you have questions. Second call is question. Is always first answer, second question. Fine, okay. And so for React, that's enough to know the order of calls to use state. But unfortunately, this has the side effect that we cannot put a name here in state unless they do tricks, different tricks. They update this plugin and so on. Okay, but anyway. This is the content of the state, and as usual, we can expect it. Okay? Props, no props, but if you go to table, you will receive props, answer table, sorry. You will receive props, list of answers. That is actually the state. Okay? It's actually the reference to the array that is contained in the state. Okay, good. And now, we have the state, right? But I mean, to play a little bit, we want to modify the state. Without modifying the state, I mean, the state is useless, right? Either somebody modifies it for us, like we load it from the server, and that's already a result, or, but for later, or we need to modify the state. It means we need to have an event that modifies the state. And the event in our application is the click on the button, on the vote, okay? And we will only modify the vote, okay, just for simplicity. Okay, good. So, list of answers, answer table, we need to attach some event handlers to the button of the vote, right? So, to the button of the vote, we need to attach some event handler. Okay, so, button, on click, function, and what we are going to do here. Actually, at the moment, I don't know what to write. I mean, the state is not in answer row, right? I need that somebody passes a function to me, to this component, answer row, that is able to modify the state. Because the state is not in answer row. I don't have a set something in answer row, okay? So I need props something, okay? Props vote, okay? But I still need to write this props vote. But, I mean, for the sake of trying to solve the problem, let's try to write how we would like to use this vote function, okay? Note that this answer row is generic, so it's for all rows. So in this vote, I should say in which row I am, okay? So is there an ID? I hope so. I don't remember, let's check. Answers have an ID. Okay, good, that's good, okay? Is it passed to us? Yes, because we have props answer E, and E has all the fields, okay? So props vote E ID, that's fine, okay? But we need to write this props vote. Okay, answer row is rendered by answer table. So answer row, it means that a certain point has to have vote equal to what? I mean, it should be a function that modifies the state. Is the state in answer table? No, it is not. There is no state, right? So again, somebody renders the answer table. And so again, we just take the props that comes from what the component that renders the answer table. So let's call it in the same way so it's easy, right? Vote, props vote, what's the problem? Sorry, I was already there. Okay. I forgot to delete it. I mean, because I start from the solution and then I delete, I go back to the first version and then I develop it during the lecture, right? Okay, it's already there. Vote, props, vote, sorry for that. So who is rendering answer table. I think it was up, right? Yeah. Yeah, vote is not here, right? Here we need to write something. No, props vote is not good. Okay? Because here we have the state, right? So here we can write the function that modifies the state. We are in main, and here we can write that function. Okay? So let me see what I wrote in the beginning. I wrote a function, since I have to write a few statements, I cannot write it as an arrow function. I mean, I can write everything in JavaScript, but I mean, writing is one thing, making it readable is another. Okay? So just define a name. I think it was vote answer. Vote answer. Answer. And then we can define a function, const vote answer ID. Okay? Why ID? Because on the other side, I expected to pass an ID when I use it in the event handler. Okay? So this function that I pass around needs to take a parameter that is the ID of the answer. Okay? Okay, good. So this is just a function, right? So a way of defining a function with the arrow syntax, because it's so convenient. You can write a function, vote answer, etc. That's the same. And now here we have the state, right? Stop suggesting. Okay, so we need to change the state. Set answer. I'm trying to do the reasoning that you should do to develop this function, okay? Because of course I can copy paste and that's all, right? But you need to set the state with what? With a new array. Okay, it's an array. If it is an array, I want to put a new array. Let's keep the same type, otherwise we get confused quite easily. Okay? So let's take the old value. Okay, I already said old value, so you should know that, I mean, there's something that should be updated here, okay? And we said, how do we update a value? Okay, I introduced this slide just for this purpose, because you have an example from which we can start. Create a new array, map, decide which item needs to be updated, create a new object. Okay? So, map, create a new array. A, that's the element of the array. I think I used E because it's element. Okay? If EID equal to ID, that's good. Return the new object. E score plus 1. I want to do plus 1. Let's assume that vote means plus 1. Okay? Note how I wrote it. The bracket creates a new object. I cannot update the object saying E score equal E score plus 1. That's wrong. That's what I wrote here. That's wrong. Okay? I cannot do it like this. Because React wants a reference to a new object. And so first I copy the old object. You remember the spread syntax that works on objects? So it copies the old object, and then we take the score that has been copied, and we update the score. Okay? E score plus 1. But this is a new object. Else, just return. Old objects are fine if they don't change. Okay? And that's good. Let's make sure all brackets are balanced. Okay? Almost okay. What is wrong here? I mean, in principle, if you test it, it should work. But I don't want to test it, because otherwise you think it's okay, right? Just because it works. What is wrong here is that we are computing a new array starting from an old array. And that's the situation we said before. We want to pass a callback to the set value, to the set state function. Because the new value depends on the old one. And so if people clicks on a button on another and so on, we don't lose operation. Otherwise, it might happen that we use a value that has not been yet updated and we lose some operations. Okay? So what is wrong here is that we should pass a callback to the set answers. Answer list. I call it in a different way, otherwise you never know what I'm referring to, okay? The JavaScript interpreter doesn't get confused. I can write answer, 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 and so on, because it's a callback, you can reuse the name and so on. But, I mean, otherwise everything is answer and you don't understand anything, right? Because this answer list is not the state. It's a parameter of the function you're passing to the set answers. It will become the state when React decides to use this callback, because it wants to update the state. Okay, that's why I want to call it in a different way, just to make sure you understand the difference. Okay, I think we can test it. Hopefully everything is balanced and the application has been loaded. Let's click 4, 5, 6. Let's test the second button. 2, 3, 4. Great. Let's check the state is being updated. Yes, state first, 6, click 7, and so on, okay? The only thing you might notice, I mean, this is just a curiosity. You see, one is answer and the other is not. It's because we didn't create new answer and so on, okay? We just created the object. You see the code here, just returns the object. If you want to have the answer, return new answer and so on. But that's JavaScript, you know. It's up to you if you decide, if you're really, if you really want to use object-oriented programming styles, of course, create a new answer object and so on. But you know that in JavaScript, objects have no type, okay? They can have a prototype, but we didn't talk about prototypes and so on. But I mean, I don't want to make a short story long. Just create a new object, that's fine, okay? And only if you really cannot live without objects and classes and so on. Okay, create the new answer. Okay, we still have time for one additional modification. And so, I mean, the vote is fine, right? So application is mostly okay. Let's assume we want to also delete an answer, okay? So we have the button. Instead of vote, just vote, we have the second button. So answer components, second button, td, button, delete. Okay, good. Props delete. Actually, I already had the delete, so I guess it guessed from here, right? Delete, I would say button variant danger. So, oops, it's red. Okay, not so nice, right? I mean, because the first row has no actions, and you know, I missed one element in the header row and so on. So maybe you want to encapsulate everything inside a single TD. I mean, this is just stuff that I mean, it's easy to fix, and also the AI is so good at fixing it. But always check what you're doing, right? Okay, both delete. I mean, they are sticked together, but we don't care at the moment. Okay, just in case you can have MX. No, what's the class name? Oops. Oh. When it has to suggest, it doesn't suggest MX1. Okay, just to show you. I mean, there are classes from Bootstrap that you can use if you really cannot suffer this button stick together, okay? But we don't care. I mean, sometimes I throw them there, but if you look at the documentation and so on, I mean, it's so easy to find a solution. I mean, which doesn't really maybe look as you like, but it's nicer at least, okay? So, on click, props delete, EID, that's fine, right? EID, we get it from props, and so answer table, we're going up, and answer table is here. So we need to pass it, delete answer, and we create a delete answer function, right? So again, same, const delete answer. Okay, set answers. Answer list, filter, EID different from ID. That's what we wrote on the slide, right? I hope. Yes, that's the syntax, right? We know which item we want to delete. This is I. And we make a condition which is true for all the items except the one we want to delete. EID different from ID. ID is passed as a parameter. And you see, now it got it right. Okay, before it got it wrong because it didn't have the callback that says the new state depends on the previous state. Save it, test it. What is here, right? Click, disappears. Click, disappears. Click, disappears. How do we make it appear again? I mean, we reload the application. There's no way of doing it in a simple way. I mean, you want an undo button. I mean, an undo button is a different concept. It has to keep the previous state, so you need to an additional state and so on. I mean, it's quite complex to implement, right? Or maybe you want to add something new. Well, you need a form. When next time we will talk about forms, and we will add a new item written by the user. Okay, new text, author, and so on. Okay, but you need a form, so you need form controls, text boxes, and so on. So it's quite long stuff, and it will take 3 hours next week. Okay, but I mean, deleting is simple, right? I mean, let's have a look at the state again. Just make sure everything is working as you expect. Main, you see the state for answers. I click on the delete, one should disappear. You see, one has disappeared. 0, 1, 2 is just the order in the array, okay? The ID is inside the object, 2, 3, 4, and so on, okay? 3, 4, if I delete the 3, so the middle one, it should disappear, okay? And so you have the 2 and the 4, okay? Good, so now we have a React application. Just to recap, the React application has a state. The state contains the data that we want to show. Okay? We update the data. Since it's a state, we do it with the set state provided by React. So this function, set answers. We use it in a proper way. We need a function, we need to pass a callback that takes the old state and creates the new state and returns the new state. That's what has been done by these functions, okay, with the arrow syntax. And once we set the new state, everything is over for us developers. The rest is up to React. React updates the view. So it's React that decides what to show. I click on vote, and then the score gets automatically updated. That's the purpose of React. Something has changed in states and in props. React updates the view. Okay? That's the purpose of React. Of course, the example is very simple, but think about Facebook, right? Actually, it's Facebook now, Meta, that designed React. They had so many things to update and so on, a lot of states, so a lot of data to keep track of and so on. And at a certain point, the code was too messy, and simply they were not able to update the view depending on what they loaded from the server, asynchronously maybe, when you scroll down, scroll up, and so on. So that's why they designed this system. So they said, okay, we just care about what we should render, and then we write a library that, depending on the state that contains the data, it will make the user interface coherent with the state, okay? And of course, we have some restrictions, like to update the state, we need to use functions provided by the library, means the set state functions provided by React, okay? But the rest happens automatically. If we use the library correctly, so the React library correctly, everything is handled automatically. And last remark, I mean, we are looking at React because it's we think it's simple to use. It's used a lot in actual real applications. If you go around in web applications, it's used a lot. But mostly all the frameworks work in this way. There is a state, a client state in the application that contains either user data or some presentation state, but that's minor stuff. And once this state changes, they take the task of updating the user interface. Okay, but because that's a difficult part, right? And that's the part where you should write a lot of code. Okay, so the principles are quite generic, even though in each framework you have different ways of handling things, like updating the state, defining what the state is, and so on and so on. Okay, of course we are seeing how it works in React. Okay, and next time we will discuss about forms. Okay, so we have the last part, how to add a new row to our application. Okay, and then router and so on. But I mean, that's for next week. Okay, next lab is about implementing a state in your application, the list of fields, and implementing actually, I think the votes, right? So just the stars. Okay. You have the stars 1 to 5, it's like ranking, like a vote here, and then delete a film, okay? Which is easy because deleting is easy. Just remove it from the structure, data structure. Okay, if there are no questions, I think that's all for today. Thank you for listening and see you on Monday, right? Monday for talking about forms.